Hello and welcome back everybody to Scottish Independence Podcasts. Our guest this week is a favourite of ours. This is Dr. Craig Dalzell, Policy Director of Common Weal. We've chatted with Craig on many topics over the years. This time we're looking at housing, particularly in light of the fact there is a housing crisis, and also because Craig has not long written an article in the Sunday National with some suggestions to Màiri McAllan about how she might tackle the housing crisis.
Exactly. And it's Craig who contacted us and said, can you come and do this? I read the article. It's great. There's a beginning, there's 4 sections, there's an ending, conclusions bit. Fantastic. We'll just use that for the structure. We didn't quite stick to the sections the whole time. We roamed elsewhere, but very enjoyable talking to Craig. When I read the article, I thought, maybe it sounds a bit the wrong way around here, but I think we start off with your conclusions. That's a good way to get into it, because you kind of summarise the situation and got it in front of me. The housing emergency in Scotland is perhaps second only to the climate emergency. And, well, Màiri McAllan, the new housing minister, used to be the energy minister. That would be a good thing to unpack, actually, in itself. And then you also go, I think this is a very typical sentence of yours, Craig. What won't solve it, the housing emergency, is shoveling more money into the paws of private developers under the guise of affordable housing that is barely either. So that's another good one to unpack. And yeah, like again, and then you finish off by saying, none of this is going to be sorted with a single tweak anywhere, or even all of the things that you suggested in your article isn't going to solve it. But every single step is going to help more people in Scotland to A, get a house, and B, live in a house that is what's needed given their particular circumstances, but also the climate circumstances. So I really appreciated reading the article.
What is the current state of the housing emergency?
Well, I'll approach that one from taking it up from that angle of why did I say it was second only to the climate emergency? And the climate emergency, obviously, is global and it's existential. If we get this wrong, civilization as we know it is going to be fundamentally very, very different. But the climate emergency also impacts the way we do look at housing, and the way we do housing impacts the climate emergency. The two are very, very closely linked. A lot of our carbon emissions comes from the fact that our heating is fundamentally gas powered. A vast chunk of Scotland's heating is gas or oil. I've got an oil boiler in my house. We're in the process of trying to, as a nation, we're in the process of trying to electrify that, but then that has all the impacts that it has on energy policy and everything that flows out from that. But we spend too much on our energy, so we need to redesign our buildings and retrofit the ones we already have to reduce those energy bills, reduce the energy demand. But even then, what does that mean in the context of changing climate? One of the lesser appreciated things that's going to happen in Scotland and elsewhere is not just we don't just need to change our heating demand in our houses, but our cooling demand. We need warm houses in the winter, but as climate warms up, these houses can very, very easily be over-insulated. And then we end up 30, 40, 50 years down the line with people suffering in the summer through overheating. It's a very complex problem. And that's just the retrofitting problem. That's not the problem of housing supply or the problem of housing ownership and how much it costs to actually just live in a house, whether it's well designed or not. The housing crisis is problems at every single stage of the housing sector, from construction and materials through to ownership, through to running costs. Everything needs to change.
Yeah, so it's not just the number of houses as a number, it's the quality of those houses and everything else. I mean, I did find the home ownership 2022 census, it surprised me actually, because I kind of looked at it and thought, that doesn't seem too bad.
That thing of the housing supply being around a number, one of the most frustrating things I get when talking to politicians when they're coming up with housing policy is how many houses we built last year, how many houses are we going to build next year? And often the number that comes out isn't really based on anything more than a bigger number than we built the last year, or a bigger number than the previous government, who is now the party in opposition, built. That discourse, we get it in Scotland, we get it in the UK, we get it all over the place. Of we built this many houses, which was more than you built when you were in power. And that's the wrong way to look at this thing. But I don't care how many houses the government built last year. Was it enough?
Yeah, and that I've got
That's
here.
The question that isn't asked.
Here, this came from the 21 to 2022 housing bit of the census, and I was quite surprised at it was the number of households that are owned as opposed to rented. It's about 62% actually is owner, whether it's on a mortgage or owned outright. And there was only just under 40% was rented. And then there was a whole other section of student accommodation and homes and things. But the other thing that we saw was in terms of homelessness, the number of homeless applications there we've got is nearly 41,000, which is clearly a shortfall. But the thing that caught my eye was when the note underneath, and this is from ScotGov, where it said the increases are largely due to Glasgow, with the highest numerical increases. So nothing about the kind of rural or islands dimension, which is perhaps a different thing. But also Glasgow have attributed these to an increase in applications from asylum seekers and refugees. Homelessness applications in Glasgow from those present in the UK, because they've been granted refugee status, have nearly doubled. Now, when I read that, I thought, was that bit written by Farage? It seems to be a really strange thing just to home in on.
Well, it might be the case, though. I mean,
it might well be the case, but what that tells me is there's a real problem with duty of care, and this is something that we pushed for when we were trying to design the National Care Service, and sadly that's gone the way it's gone, and that it's not going. But a core aspect of that National Care Service would have been about, in our minds, that transition of what happens when someone who is an asylum seeker has their asylum case approved, they are now officially a refugee. Well, right now what happens is they get their asylum seeker support, pitiful though it is, removed from them. They get kicked out of the asylum seeker hostel they were in, and then what? They don't have the right to work that asylum seekers don't have, which asylum seekers should have. But where is the support to get someone their house, get someone a job, get someone integrated into society? That's where we're failing refugees.
But again, just looking at those numbers, I mean, they were talking about they doubled in the last year to 2,000, but the actual gap is 40-odd thousand. So it's a tiny part of
So what we're seeing there is, the increase in number can be maybe attributed to refugees, but the actual number of refugees in Scotland is still tiny. And it's
exactly.
I mean, the homelessness problem is not caused entirely by refugees. They are a part of the people who are experiencing it.
So is it? Because I have to admit, when I first started reading, when the housing crisis started to be talked about a bit more here, so from my point of view, that was the last 6 months. I'm guessing you've known about it for longer than that. But I had a sort of surprised. I went, have Scotland got a housing crisis? Why? And that may just be me talking from a particular generation's kind of assumptions about the availability of housing. I mean, look at private renting, and I mean, my response to that is, God, how can folk afford to pay that amount of money? But so is it that we don't have enough houses per se, or we don't have the right kind of housing? If people are homeless, it might be because they've been chucked out of their private rentals house because they couldn't keep up with the rent, or there was a whole raise in mortgages not that long ago, and people lost their houses and had to go into rented housing. So is it a kind of swirl of people and current of people going from one to the next kind of houses, and we just don't have enough of some?
It's that, and where are the houses, and what kind of houses, where are the communities? You have to remember that homelessness is something that can affect anyone. You're not much more, you're not much more than one bad day away from wondering where you're going to sleep tonight. And we just, again, don't have that system of care around us that if you came home from work today and your house had burned down, what do you do?
Yes,
where
absolutely.
do you go?
If we just look in terms of pure numbers, should we even have a housing crisis? In 2024, there were 2,552,400 households in Scotland. But there were 2,741,000 dwellings. Of those, 91,000 are vacant dwellings, another 21,600 are second homes, and then we have this other category of 75,000, not sure what that would mean. Clearly the problem is more complicated than just total numbers of buildings, because on paper at least, we seem to have more than enough. So what's going on?
There are more vacant houses in Scotland than there are homeless households.
I went for a little walk round Tillycootree, which is just along the road from me. Just in one street, there was 4 different examples of houses empty for different reasons. It certainly showed me there can be lots of different reasons why this happens. This is Tillycootree, Moss Road, and nice area, lovely views, very handy for the shops. But just in the space of this tiny little block, this house here was empty, abandoned for a couple of years. I think it has just sold, but it was on for a fixed price of 165,000, completely gutted inside, stood empty for years, probably abandoned because of what happened next door. This rubble here used to be a similar sized house. That stood empty for 20 years. Nobody knew who the owner was. Eventually, kids broke in, set fire to the roof, and then the owner was tracked down. He demolished it. He lives in Perth somewhere. He demolished it a couple of years ago, and he's just left the plot like that. What a mess. Right across the road from that, this used to be the old police substation. Again, completely gutted inside. You can pick this up for a fixed price of 120,000. This one was a £500,000 house, which was newly built, and then it turned out that the access road wasn't owned by the people who owned the house. The place has been abandoned. And this, traditional houses, there was one on the end plot there, owner died, somebody bought the plot, got rid of the old house, and they put this on it. Offers over £725,000, if you're interested.
And that really shows the disparity. I mean, I love kind of mixed communities, and we'll talk about this later, I'm sure, is the importance not just of a roof over your head, but of the community you build around it. We can't ghetto people into the little wealth bubbles and hope to have a stable society. But it does show you that disparity, that you have a £600,000 house right across the road from a fixed price vacant property. And there's people that couldn't afford either of them.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And then, the fact that there's some are derelict because they don't know who owns them. And that just went on for decades.
I was a bit surprised, Fiona, when because you showed me that wee video before about that, like, you wouldn't know who owned the land. Because, I mean, there is a land register in Scotland. Although, admittedly, if it was a company that was overseas, that might be more difficult. But that gets us to who owns the land, doesn't it, Craig? And that is a big part of this problem that we've got.
Yeah, and and the land register was supposed to have been completed a number of years ago, but it's still not there yet. And there's still big gaps in identifying owners in particular areas, and identifying the owner of a particular plot can be very difficult. As someone who's been around that journey myself, I know how difficult that can be. I probably get my most radical when it comes to land ownership issues. I often think if we really need a land tax, and if you find any plot that's not paying its land tax, confiscate it and put it in the common, bring it back into common ownership.
I mean, that's what I was thinking when I was watching that video of those places. I was thinking, well, would it be so awful if Scott Guffer, better if it was your local authority, actually had the power after a certain length of time to go in and say, look, we're taking this over. I mean,
yeah, local authorities do have that power. They have the power of compulsory sales order, which is to compel the owner to sell the property, and they can put it onto the open market if they want. They can, but it's just they have to get rid of it. And local authorities do have the power of compulsory purchase orders as well, which is when they forcibly buy the property. And it has been used. Glasgow's actually getting better at doing this, pushing it through. There are still aspects where there comes down to arguments over the price of the property when they're purchasing it. Often the landlords are holding on to these derelict properties in very poor repair because they're just hoping they can flip it at some point for a profit. Again, I take the attitude that the compulsory purchase, okay, we'll start at market rate as the starting point in negotiation, but the landlord shouldn't, or the owner shouldn't profit from leaving their houses in disrepair. So the repair costs and the retrofitting costs should come off that compulsory purchase. And if that means the property's worth £1, then the local authority buys it for £1. Yeah. But even when you do that then places the burden of repairing it on the local authority, and they often don't have the funds to do that. This is where we'll probably come into this about my proposals on providing more social housing through better finance would be key to that as well. Properties and repairing and retrofitting them.
Well, you put it as actual land reform, which I take it that the fact that the word actual is in there is a bit of a message about what you think of the land reform bill so far that have gone through Holyrood. But well, you can't build a home without having the land to build on it. Yeah. And that's a problem. Now, it's a problem everywhere in Scotland, but we know it's a particular problem up in rural Scotland, and maybe particularly in the Highlands and Islands, where there's lots of space, but there's also that space is owned sometimes by a very, very small number of people. So that's one aspect of it, land reform.
The current land reform bill, quite frankly, isn't going to reform a lot of land. It's not going to give communities the access that they need. It might improve things around the management of some of the land by placing extra regulations on how that land is used by the owners. But there are so many loopholes and wiggle rooms at the moment. I know there are people that campaign around it, are campaigning to try and close some of these loopholes. Things like the burden of having to produce a land management plan applies if your estate is above a certain size, but not if you own two estates of the same size or non-contiguous estates of that same size. So it seems to me fairly trivial that if you were a laird who didn't want to have to manage their land, then you would split the legal ownership of your estate among 3 or half a dozen trust funds that you are the sole owner of, and that would fall under the threshold. Yeah. Even where there could be regulations around compelling communities to have a first option to purchase land when it comes up for sale, that means nothing if the community doesn't have the money and can't raise the money.
Yeah, and it takes a long
time. We've seen this in community buyouts or attempted community buyouts where they're told, well, you can buy it, but it'll cost you $5 million, and they know that they can't get that $5 million together, or even if they could, they can't get it together in the time required. So there's a lot of lobbying going around the bill to try and basically pause a sale. Where a community expresses an interest in purchasing it, pause it until the community can run through the process and then say yes or no at the end of it.
And that section in your article, you mentioned Mercedes Villalba, who's a MSP. She's a Labour MSP, isn't she?
Labour MSP, yes.
But I think it's quite a while back, but she was proposing reducing the limit on a land sale, because at the moment it's actually quite big before you start getting any of these community kind of usage or looking at how does it benefit community benefits. And I think she was wanting to reduce that quite substantially. Did anything come of that?
Yes, actually. I mean, the very first draft of the land reform bill, it was proposing thresholds in the order of about 3,000 hectares, which is a massive area.
Massive, yeah.
Larger than some towns. The Scottish Government has been under pressure that they have reduced that down to, it looks as if it's going to be about 1,000 hectares, which is still a massive area. You can still see a lot of estates on the market. If you go to the kind of real estate folk who deal with that kind of thing, you can still see a lot of estates that fall below that threshold. There are some better regulations around where an estate takes up a significant percentage of the local area. So this is particularly on the islands. There are inhabited islands in Scotland that are less than 1,000 hectares, which means that you could see the prospect of a single owner owning the entire island, but because they fall below the threshold, they're not affected. Mercedes Villalba's bill was also about putting a public ownership test on the maximum amount of land that someone could own in Scotland. She was aiming at around 500 hectares. She wasn't suggesting a complete ban on someone owning more than that, but it would have to be subject to a public interest test. And again, that could be community driven. That could be, okay, we've got the Laird DLs coming in to buy another 100 hectares in this village. He already owns 3,000 elsewhere. Is he a fit person to buy this estate? And there could be a public interest test around that. The bill is still going through. There's not a lot of time left in this parliamentary session. If things haven't been conclusively voted on by the time Parliament dissolves, I think in mid-March next year, then the bill will fall.
We have a couple of sweet little pictures to show you as well. Because both Marlene and I started life not in the same council house, but in council houses. So first of all, here is,
that's me.
If you can guess which one was which, that one was Marlene.
I'll tell you, I have a bar of chocolate in my hand. That's why there's an angelic look on my face. But that's the back of a, big garden at the back, and it was a block of 4 houses, 2 flats, one above the other. We had a ground floor flat. It was pre-war, pre-Second World War. It had 1 bedroom, so we were obviously still in it at that point. I look about 2 or 3, don't I? But we quickly were moved out of that because Cooper were building a new housing estate at the other side of the town, and Mum and Dad, with only 1 bedroom, were on their housing list to get a bigger house. So we moved up to the new housing estate, lovely semi-detached house, massive garden in the front, massive garden at the back, and it all just happened like that. It just seems in retrospect such a good setup that we had.
My grandmother's house, which she moved into in 1930 and lived in till about 1980. My parents lived there for the first 2 years of their marriage. I was born there, and as an adult, I went back to Aberdeen, was my first job, and I lived with my grandmother again for another 2 years. And it was only when she went into eventually sheltered housing that she gave up that house. And it just struck us how common that was in Scotland. I don't know if you had a similar experience. You're a bit younger than us, Craig. Our generation, that was common, that was normal.
Yeah.
And the difference between the instability and insecurity of people's tenure now in the rented sector, with those, you could live there your entire life, or, as Marlene's example, you could move to something that was more suitable, but you weren't getting kicked out. The rent wasn't being put up over your head. Yeah. That insecurity that people, I think, must be terribly stressful for people.
I mean, the other thing that you could do, because we got to a point, Dad moved job, we had to move to Perth. So what he did was he organised a council house swap. And it wasn't even a 2-way council house swap, it was a 3-way council house swap. And I have no idea how he managed to do it, but there must have been a way of finding out. So, 3 families needing to move, it all happened, and we all ended up with a pretty good council house in the new place where the family needed to be. I mean, that's just such a civilised kind of, approach to housing, isn't it?
It all comes down to Thatcher, doesn't it? That whole process of demolishing the social housing sector did away with all of those stories that you're talking about. Yeah. Now, I know folk who have benefited from right to buy on an individual basis who managed to use that to secure their tenure. I've kind of benefited it in an indirect way. The house I'm in just now is a former right to buy, and while the person who bought it under that made a significant profit when they sold it, because the houses were sold at such a discount, it was still sold at a rate that was affordable for me to buy. But I can see in my street that a lot of the design philosophy around the social housing of the time as well, that the houses weren't built on an individual basis. They were built on a street, on a community basis. Yeah. The house that I'm in is a one bedroom bungalow end terrace. The rest of the terrace are 2-story family homes. The original design philosophy, and we've got flats across the road and various other forms of housing that were all originally social housing just in this street. The original design philosophy here was that once someone was getting a bit older, their kids have moved out, they want to downsize, they could literally move next door from the family house next door into the 1-bedroom bungalow, into a house that was a bit more their size, lovely garden to putter around in, but they didn't have to leave their community.
Yeah.
That was critical.
Social
you could keep that community fabric together. And we've lost a lot of that with the cookie cutter suburb estates that we ended up with in subsequent years. We've lost a lot of that in terms of what social housing is for. The kind of popular attitude of social housing these days is that social housing is kind of the next best step before homelessness. It's what you go into before you run out of options, whereas it shouldn't be. The post-war periods you were talking about, social housing was the standard to beat.
Yeah, that was how people lived. That whole idea with buy-to-let, which infuriates me really, because it's brought that profit element in to housing that was never really there. Social housing was for the benefit of people. Buy-to-let is for the benefit of the person who buys it and lets it out. And then immediately you change the relationship between that person and the property. That is a business to you, but it's somebody's home. It's not the same as just lending somebody a car and then wanting it back. It just seems to be a mindset that is completely different to what the whole purpose of social housing is.
And again, that comes back to Thatcher, but even the idea of what house ownership is for goes back to that. I mean, house ownership, it's still quite important for a lot of people. But the reason it has become important in Britain especially is because we've got into this mindset that house prices have to perpetually increase. And the reason it has to do that is because you climb the housing ladder, you get a bigger house, you have a family, the kids move out, you sell the house, you downsize, you take that capital, and that funds your retirement. It's a very particularly British thing that happens in. If you look around Europe at the source of income for pensioners, I look at, say, Sweden, where something like 90% of a retired person's income comes from the public sector pension, either the state pension or a publicly owned workplace pension fund. In Britain, it's more like 50%. The other 50%, about half of it is private pensions, and about half of it is capital. So we've effectively used the house price bubble to subsidise the state pension.
That can only carry on as long as there's enough people able to come in at the first step, the buying the first house. If the number of those people decreases, when we bought our first house, I mean, we weren't particularly, we both had jobs, we weren't particularly highly paid, but we weren't particularly well off. But, it was 3 times your salary, it was fine, it was very manageable. It's much more difficult to do that now. So there must come a point where this kind of bubble system just is going to collapse.
And the warning signs are already there. The key metric for me in this that I've been kind of shouting about for the last few years, and I see other actual economists talk about this. I've seen articles in the Financial Times start to worry about this. The rise in the number of people in their 50s and 60s who are privately renting but can't sell the house and release the capital. And they can't save for a proper pension because they're paying it all in rent. There's a big problem of pensioner poverty coming as a direct result of that entire scheme of inflating a housing bubble to subsidise the state pension. And that's going to pop. It's already starting to pop. The rise in pensioner poverty due to the private rented sector and the inability to fund a retirement is growing rapidly and is going to grow.
The other thing that just pops into my mind is you said that quoted earlier on that some 60%, 62% of homeowners in Scotland they own. There's a footnote to that, which is probably because of our ageing population. Those are the people who, they've had the mortgage, they've paid it off, they're now living in their house. It may be too big for their needs nowadays, but they're still in it. And that in itself is partly restricting the housing supply because things aren't moving around. Where I live, that picture of that £600,000 house, people would far rather build things that size in this village because they can get huge money for it. But what people in the village want, what the older folk, often women, widows, they might be in a great big 5-bedroomed house. They want somewhere nice in the community to downsize into, as you were explaining before. There's a very shortage of little suitable bungalows in this area.
They're harder to make a profit on. The materials and the time to build it, and the land itself. It's not that much cheaper to build a 1-bedroom bungalow than it is to build your £600,000 mansion. or mini mansion, but you get a lot more money for the mini mansion than you do for the bungalow, so you get a higher profit. So there's that push on that side of things to build those bigger, higher pricing houses. And when you look at the market and you know, well, nobody's going to live in it, it's going to be a buy to let or it's going to be a buy to flip.
Yes.
The house has become a commodity rather than a home. So it doesn't actually matter who buys it as long as somebody does.
So even if there's enough houses in pure numbers, they're not suitable houses. So that gap between somebody not able to find something suitable for them because it's affordable, because it's in the right area, because the right
area thing is key as well. As I say, if I was in an unfortunate position, I needed an emergency house tonight, and someone said, "Well, there's a vacant house in Clackmannanshire." Not that much use to me.
No. Although it's very nice, you would enjoy it.
You'd be just up the road from Fiona. We've kind of homed in a bit, actually, for very good reasons, on the difficulties in all this. But in this particular article that you wrote, you were also proposing what could be at least partial solutions to moving this on. So with housing, social housing, I mean, you talk quite a bit about borrowing powers from, well, the local council have got more borrowing powers than the Scottish government, well, more laxity in them. And, and we do have a Scottish National Investment Bank, whether that's the place to be able to get money for it.
Yeah, so this plan of ours to build unlimited social housing, without dumping a bunch of debt on future generations. There's a self-funding proposal. It tackles several aspects. It tackles that place aspect we talk about, because you can start planning on a community-wide basis. Rather than just individual houses. It takes on that setting the standard thing I mentioned in social housing. What I want to see is these houses being built at the highest level of energy efficiency for climate reasons, for comfort reasons as well. Why do we have a heating bill when we can design a house that doesn't need one? At the time I wrote the paper, Good Houses for All, we were still arguing that Scotland had to raise basic building standards across the board to meet the climate challenges. And we saw one way of doing that as saying, right, okay, if you're not going to raise the minimum energy efficiency for new build housing, you can still unofficially raise it by building a bunch of social housing at the highest possible energy efficiency, and put people in the position of saying, well, I could buy a house or I could privately rent a house. If I privately rent, it's going to cost me 3 times as much, and I can see the water running down the walls, and the landlord doesn't live here, don't even know who they are. How do I get anything fixed? Or I can have that council house that costs a fraction in the rent and is much more comfortable. You start using the social housing to outcompete the private sector on standards and on price.
That's clever.
And then the council, or whoever has put up the money in the first place, they are then getting an income.
Yes,
house.
This is a key thing that I can't believe I still have to argue this with the Scottish Government. We've been doing this with our plans over the Public Energy Company as well. They say, we can't do it, we don't have the powers, we don't have the borrowing powers. Local authorities do. Local authorities have much broader borrowing powers than the Scottish Government, especially when it comes to what's known as prudential borrowing. So local authorities are allowed to borrow money so long as they can make the case that the investment will pay back the loan. So you build a house, you get rent, you pay back the loan. Now this is harder to do with something like a school or a hospital where there isn't that same revenue stream, which is why we had the whole PFI debacle. That's another podcast. But in housing, it's much more trivial. In energy companies as well, much more trivial. The investment pays for itself. And local authorities have multiple ways of getting that money. The most direct one is the Public Works Loan Board, which I know has been used for social housing. So I know this works, but we also suggested the Scottish National Investment Bank. And we suggested that specifically for the reason that we want to use the mass social house building programme to support the SNIB's borrowing portfolio. So we want to expand the SNIB and use the revenue it gets from the social housing to then branch out and start investing in energy and basically support a very stable lending environment that can then be used to invest in slightly more riskier things, like what is the next new Scottish tech invention that might come around the corner but might not. Right now, the SNIB is mostly focused on that top tier, and it's left itself probably kind of vulnerable by not having that foundation under it.
That's really clever, isn't it? So people get a better house. A local authority has a loan on it to build it, but they also have a revenue stream from it. So that's and then SNIBs, that's the National Investment Bank, Scottish National. They also get income because they've lent it to the local authorities, and that gives them an income stream. I mean, that's a kind of intelligent way to run an investment bank, I would think.
And meanwhile, you've created a demand for a whole load of jobs and a whole load of firms involved in the building process. So they then have more money going into the economy.
I'm really glad you shared those photos of the post-war building, because one of my favourite quotes from any politician of the 20th century came from Nye Bevan, who's most famous for the NHS, but also famous for being the architect of that post-war house building boom. He gave a speech where he said, if you want to build a house, first you've got to get everything else right. You've got to sort out the jobs and the materials and the supplies and the planning and the design of the community. So the house is the end product of a success of a lot of other things going right in the economy. Yeah. So the converse is also kind of true. If you see problems in the housing sector, there's a lot of other things unravelling underneath that as well.
Yeah. This is a different model. And okay, it's aimed at people who've got all sorts of complicated problems resulting in them being homeless and needing to get brought back in. But even in the solution of that, there's some really interesting things that they're doing.
So the first village launched in Edinburgh back in 2018, so it's been going for almost 7 years now, and it's been an amazing little community that's really thrived down in the north of Edinburgh. We try and take that time where someone's in a pretty desperate situation where they find themselves homeless, and they might be with us for 6 months, they might be with us for a year, they might be with us for 3 years, and however long they're with us at the village, we want to take that time to really build them up, give them the confidence, give them the positive relationships, and kind of try and equip them. We've seen well over 100 people now come through the village. Many have found their feet, many have gained employment, many have gone on to get their own flat and hold that flat down. So it gave us such encouragement to think, let's try and do more of this, and we've embarked on this mission to try and build 2 new villages, one in Dundee and the other one in South Lanarkshire. So it's really quite an innovative way of constructing houses. They're all entirely built in the factory.
Our adoption of a kitted parts approach, we're manufacturing in a factory in controlled conditions. We're getting that up to 90-95% complete. That then minimises the amount of time and work that has to be done on site.
It means you can utilise land, vacant land, like we are doing, in ways you might not otherwise be able to do with more traditional construction methods.
They're going to be really aspirational spaces, and that's key. There should be spaces that we would all aspire to live in. The resulting buildings have great biophilic benefits. The benefit of being in a space that is natural, sustainable materials, because it's natural material, because the build system that we have out with that is all natural materials, it's breathable. So when you go into timber space like this one that we're in, there's plenty of studies that demonstrate lower blood pressure, reduced stress levels. We're in a privileged position to be able to put all of that together into one product that really delivers that meaningful impact. And that will absolutely have a positive impact on the occupants at Social Bite.
Great. There's just so much in there, isn't there? So much that's inspirational.
One of the policies that I've seen that sounds as if it shouldn't work but does is the housing first policy. This idea that the social, economic, financial, mental health costs of homelessness are so high that if you buy a house and give it to a homeless person for free, it's cheaper than not doing it. It's just ending homelessness is cheaper than having homeless people. So it sounds as if it shouldn't work, and it sounds as if politically it shouldn't work. Well, why should that person get a house for free when I've had to pay so much for my house? Doesn't matter. You're paying more for that homeless person existing in a state of homelessness than you would be if they weren't. So this initiative, this housing first policy is something that I've been shouting about it for years, and I was really glad when the Scottish Government started to take steps towards it. Again, as with everything in government, not doing enough quickly enough, but
it's a start.
And we've seen it in other countries as well. We've even seen it, Finland was obviously the example that was put up as almost completely eliminating homelessness in the country, and then they voted for a Conservative government. Homelessness is on the rise again.
They're rolling back again.
Does something like that social bite, does that run into difficulties about finding the land to build on in the first place?
Well, yeah, I mean, you saw that there's kind of scraping around for a bit of derelict brownfield site that nobody else wants. Sure, some of these areas should be redeveloped. Scotland is replete with a lot of vacant and derelict land. We have an entire register where you can look on a map and you can see all the big blobs of derelict land, legacies of various post-industrial pasts. But there's no reason why it shouldn't be. Again, this should be an area where local authorities could be identifying areas throughout their patch where housing can be developed in this way. And again, there is that slight, can be an issue of if you start ghettoising and boxing people, if they're over there in the camp. You get these stigmas attached to them. But honestly, those wee houses, I love them. Someone wants to give me a wee acre of land in one of those, I'd be more than happy.
Well, I was thinking when I saw them that actually, from being involved with Citizens Advice in Glasgow, that asylum seekers are often, they come out from not being asylum seekers, but actually, able to stay. They're given a flat up in a high-rise block in Glasgow, and God, when you look at what that would be like as an experience of living in it, often damp, often really difficult to heat for all the reasons that you've already said, compared to that social bite when you've got a little, even if it's a one-off or for a couple or something, how much more that's going to benefit people's mental health as well. Just absolutely brilliant. But I can see there's the point of where do you put them, and to take on board as well.
Don't be too harsh on the high rises either. I know people who have had a wonderful time in high rises.
Yeah, I know.
They can often be quite easy to heat because especially if you're near the top, because the heat from everyone else rises up. The views are spectacular. I mean,
well, there is that. That's true. You've
got the community aspect as well. So again, a well-designed high rise would just start to factor in things like community and place and all those other things that are as important as a roof over your head. High density housing in the cities is very important as well. It gives you access to the wider services. So we can't just say, right, one cookie cutter house for everyone. We do need a mix of a lot of different things.
Fair enough. I take back what I said about housing.
I mean, the other thing that I keep sort of ties in with this, I think, in my head, which you can maybe comment on, is we keep hearing, but if you put rent controls in, the landlords will sell. And you think, but the house is still there. Why is that a problem?
Yeah, and we look around Europe, and there's a lot of places that have much stricter controls for tenants' rights, to the point where if a landlord does want to sell, often there are restrictions on the tenant remains in place. Tenants, you could even imagine giving the tenant the option to buy. I would like to see, if the landlord is deciding, well, this is no longer profitable for me, I'm getting out of the sector. Well, first option to buy, local authority, bring the house back into the social housing stock. But again, keep the tenant in place, offer them a lifetime tenancy.
And that whole still vacant housing thing, if what they're having to do is refurbish what they voids, I think they're called. I mean, the idea that would then be owned by the council because somebody else has not done right by that property, then they would build up their stock of housing. Is that feasible? Is that possible?
This is something that we're actively researching here at Common Weal. We've got a project on this, especially for the housing that sometimes isn't classified as housing. A lot of, if you go down into the town high street and you look up above the shops, a lot of shops in Scotland have houses above them, have residential blocks above them, and a lot of those are still classified as commercial on the public records. So they don't appear on the vacant housing lists to the same degree. So actually that issue of vacant housing in Scotland is probably a lot worse than the initial figures look. But it is often cheaper to retrofit a house than it is to build a new one. So we're looking at a project of trying to cost what would it actually cost to properly retrofit a lot of these vacant above shop flats compared to building new social housing, but using the similar finance model, using that prudential SNEB or Public Work Loan Board financial model, and then using them in social housing. Again, you have the advantages there of place. You immediately revitalise high streets. A lot of these high streets were designed for a walking population, walking around shops. You don't get that if everybody lives a drive away.
Yeah. I mean, I lived for a while in Eyre Crescent in Edinburgh, just down at the edge of Cannon Mills. The wonderful thing about that was your entire community was all within walking distance. You know, there was a playground over the road, a park where the kids went and played. The primary school was just along the road. There was a library. There was an off-licence. You know, all my needs were catered for in walking distance. And what a difference it made. There certainly wasn't Airbnb everywhere. So people knew each other, and you had... You know, there was that sense of community and pride in the place.
Yeah. I know you recently featured on the podcast my speech in Perth a couple of months ago, when I was talking about what would I willingly sacrifice as part of the climate transition. My personal favourite line from that speech was, think about your community. Think about a place you can go in your community where you can accidentally meet someone you know, where you can stay for as long as you like and not have the expectation of having to buy something. There are so few places where that is true now.
Do you know when you said
meet
that?
someone in a coffee shop, I need to pay to exist there.
Yeah.
It's not the same.
When you said that in Perth, the one place that I thought of is our cycle track, which is just along from my house. And you meet people all the time there, and there's no pressure to buy anything. There's nothing you can buy on the cycle track, but it's a really social space.
Because that's where it just goes back to that, like what as a community needs to be like. Like, in front of this house that I'm in at the moment, that it's two sides of it. It's a square. There's a park in the middle. Two sides of it are, Edwardian tenement flats. The rest, one end's a church, and the bit that I'm in is, pre-war or post-war kind of semi-detached houses. But you can just go into the park. You don't have to buy anything. You can just go in and have a chat. And I was down at our local library, which is the one at White Inch, which there was a big campaign to retain as keep it open after COVID. Big local campaign, and I've started using now because it's a nicer walk for me to walk down to White Inch Library. And I went in, and it was a really cold day outside. I had just walked down, so I wasn't cold, but I kind of went anyway, chat to the wee bit to the library, and I said, "Oh God, it's really cold outside, nice and warm here." And she says, "Yes, well, you can stay all day. Some people do." And it was a kind of a joke, but actually that's quite important, isn't it? I mean, there was no. She wasn't someone who was working there that was going to get annoyed by someone coming in, sitting themselves down and reading a book for a couple of hours. It's just a place to be, and it just makes such a big difference when there's that available.
I've already talked about the social housing. It's just do it, regardless of what the law says. You can just have it as a government policy to build social housing as at higher quality than the private sector will deliver, and force them to compete on quality. But we are seeing some movement there with the Scottish Government as well. A number of years ago, I was in an interview as asked if you could have one policy, what would it be? And I said it would be building standards, make it illegal to build a house below passive energy requirements. And a couple of months later, Alex Rowley, the Labour MSP, put forward a bill to that effect in the Scottish Parliament, and the Scottish Government saw they were going to lose a vote if they resisted this. So I suspect they also didn't want to see the opposition win a vote by supporting it. So they ended up absorbing it into their building standards. So that is, again, it's a slow process, and some of my colleagues are actively working on the legislation behind the scenes on this. There's a lot of pushback from the building sector who don't want to do this because you can make more profit by building cardboard. But it's happening, and it could be that Scotland does end up with legislation to the effect of all new build properties will be built at the highest possible energy standards, which would be great. That would cover not just the social housing, but it would cover private builds as well.
I remember you talking about that a few years ago, actually, and it was in the context of the net zero. You said we need to start now. And if every new build, and this was back probably about 3 years ago, maybe more, saying if we started now, and any new houses have to have no gas central heating, but proper everything else. Now, we've lost all those years when it didn't happen.
Yeah.
And how all the building that's happened in the last few years, which is considerable, how much of that is actually reached anyway near that?
I can see houses in my village that were built between me making that speech and now that will need to be retrofitted before 2045 to meet climate standards.
That's mad.
It's an absolute waste.
Yeah, you look at any new build that is not meeting those standards, and you have to ask the person that's buying them: do you actually know what you're buying? Do you know the extra cost that the developer is dumping on you because they're lazy and want to make a quicker buck? So that needs to change, and the faster it happens, the better, because it makes the problem of retrofitting that little bit easier. Retrofitting is going to be hard. It's going to be one of the biggest infrastructure challenges in Scotland, because essentially we don't know how many houses need to be retrofitted. The answer is almost all of them. We don't know what they need to be retrofitted. In our 2019 Common Home Plan, the very first stage of our housing chapter was survey the houses. We need to know what houses are there, what retrofits they can take, because you don't want to get into the problems that the UK is now facing. We can foresaw this. The UK is now facing of cowboy developers going in, putting up spray foam insulation, meeting the legal standard of increasing the thickness of the insulation, and dumping a whole bunch of problems in the owner because it was just fundamentally unsuitable for that kind of house. We have another more subtle problem. A lot of houses in Ireland are not in sufficient levels of repair. Not casting anything against the owners in a lot of cases. This is just what happens when you have slightly older houses. None of us are as young as we used to be.
And money's tight.
If you want to insulate a loft, first you have to make sure the roof's not leaking. So we need to go through, survey the houses, find out what they need to be done to repair them, and then what needs to be done to retrofit them. And then we need to plan that retrofit. Right now, the Scottish Government policy around retrofitting is essentially to treat it as if the owners are renovating their kitchen. Everybody's going to do it individually. You're going to have to go through the hassle of finding tradesfolk to come in and do it. You've got a whole bunch of inefficiencies in that. If I hire a trader from Stirling because they've got the best reviews and they travel all the way down to where I am in Clydesdale and they retrofit my house and they go away again, then the next week my next door neighbour phones them up and asks the same question. You've got all that extra inefficiency of planning all of that. Whereas what we've suggested is what they're doing in places like Sweden and Norway, which is street-by-street renovations.
Yes.
Regardless of the tenure, regardless of whether it's rented or owned or social housing, we go in, we say, right, we are retrofitting this street. This is not a burden we're placing on individuals. This is going to be a public work retrofit. We're going to go in, retrofit all of the houses. It's going to be publicly financed. Yes, you'll pay for it back in your taxes, but you were going to pay for it anyway, whether you were doing it individually or not. But it's going to be cheaper to do that, partly because of the progressive taxation, but partly because of you start saving in all of those inefficiencies. You have better planning, you've got more standardisation in parts. Even the small things like while someone's waiting for the plaster to dry next door, they can be painting the house.
Yes, I mean that's how they roll out broadband, isn't it? That's how they change all the pipes. So we've had water pipes changed recently, and they've gone systematically round the entire village, street by street. They haven't said here Fiona, go and buy a pipe.
Are you optimistic that is going to happen in Scotland? Street by street.
It's going to happen or can happen.
We know it can happen because there's this really good bunch of people called Common Weal who've worked it all out. But what would be the trigger for that?
Government will. It just takes the government planning office, perhaps our new housing minister to decide this is the way to go. And to start making that government policy. I love my personal catchphrase in Scottish politics is everything is impossible until the moment it becomes inevitable. The moment the Scottish government decides this is happening, it will happen.
Sometimes it's more expensive and more complicated as well. But yeah.
We got a bit closer to it when, ironically, when the Greens were in government, because Patrick Harvey's Heating in Buildings bill had a lot in it that I thought, I mean, there was bits of it I thought, why would you do it that way around? But they were still thinking about it. Now I get the sense that has all sort of rode back quite a lot.
That's what that massively, just the pressure to do anything there. I mean, we had plenty of arguments with the government at that time as well. A lot of what they were proposing was still far too small scale. One of the best things that came out of it was a mandate on local authorities to map where they could place district heat networks, for instance. So every local authority now has a district heat map, but the map was still very incomplete and still very often it was focused on how could we link up all of our public buildings to a district heat network rather than how can we link up every building. So there were still limitations there, but even then that's all kind of gone by the wayside now.
What's your overall kind of, feeling about it? I mean, Craig, are you kind of optimistic that things, will move more in the kind of directions that you've been thinking through?
Folk who know me know that I come from a science background. I was a former laser physicist. I like to class things as either a physics problem. If you're arguing against the principles of thermodynamics, if you're trying to solve Scotland's heating crisis through magic technology, you're not going to work. You can't fight physics. But the rest of the problems are engineering problems. We can build better housing. We can build district heating. We can lay all the pipe that we need to connect everything up. So all the problems in this was a core aspect of our 2019 Common Home Plan. That was that we weren't going to say, well, we're fairly confident someone will invent nuclear fusion and carbon capture in 2040 and that'll fix all the problems. It was right, what can we do with the technology we have now? So I'm confident that all of the problems can be solved. And we have tried to identify how they can be solved, especially the financial side in a lot of what we do, really focusing in on that prudential borrowing and stable finance and disrupting the private housing market by just offering better solutions. I can see all the solutions. I can see what it would look like when it works. I have wonderful visions of the kind of Scotland I want to grow older in and the community I want to have around me when that happens. It's just getting there, isn't it?
Yeah, but we've got an election
just
coming
now.
up.
Exactly. So really the question I want to ask the Scottish Government is, if you don't want to do it, who do you want me to vote for who will?
Yeah. Good.
Absolutely.
That's a good question. Yeah, maybe that's the one to finish on.
This is obviously a massive area. As I said, housing impacts almost every other aspect of policy. And the reason I love my job at Common Weal is being able to see the threads between all the disparate policies and how they all connect together and start tugging on them and seeing what happens. So I would encourage folk, go onto the Common Weal website, commonweal.scot, go into our policy library. You can find hundreds of policy papers there, and many of them have impacts on policies and on housing policy in some aspect or another. Also check out our book, All of Our Futures, the one I co-wrote with my colleague Bill Johnson. It's focused really on age and ageism in Scotland, but it's got a very substantial section in there on housing, on community, on place, and how we address housing for an ageing and older society.
Excellent. We'll put links to those sites and that book as well. And the other one you mentioned was the Good Houses for All. Is that in the policy library? Good
Houses for All is our policy paper on building unlimited social housing.
Right. We'll link to that as well, and hopefully people will get a bit more informed and a bit more enthusiastic and start demanding a bit more of our elected representatives.
Yeah. Well, thanks again for coming on. Really great chatting to you.
No, thank you. I've really enjoyed it.
Fun. Thanks for listening, everybody. Hope you enjoyed that. Don't forget to subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're listening on YouTube, you can click the little bell and you get a reminder whenever we put out a new episode, which is every Friday.
And sign up for our mailing list. You can do that from the website. And we always send one out at the beginning of each month to tell you what's happening. Last but not least, you can buy us a coffee on coffee.com.
And we'll catch you later. Bye now.